We're in the midst of a study of Old Testament history, and we've been talking about over the last several weeks things that relate to the Exodus, things that relate to God's instructions to Moses and the others as it relates to preparing the people for the Promised Land. We've dealt with the idea that they were heading right towards the Promised Land as God had intended. They get to the wilderness of Paran. They send out 12 spies that God had instructed them to. They go in to spy out the land, but they come back and do what? Yeah, basically come back and make the decision on their own when God had already told them it was theirs to take. But come back and take the position that they can't take the land. The people are too great. The challenges are too difficult. You brought us out here in the wilderness to die, Moses. Let's get us a real leader. We'll go back to Egypt where things were better. And that sentiment seems to just keep recurring over and over and over again. We've talked about the fact that you can't really just read Exodus chapter 1 through Deuteronomy and Numbers as if they were chronological from what they parallel, right? They go back and forth, and you've got to kind of look at all of them to kind of get the full picture of what's happening. You remember as they brought them down, where's the first point in time where kind of congregated together, God began to give them instructions and emphasis upon what He wanted from them. Where was that located? Mount Sinai, right? So they come to Sinai, and they're there, and we did this Wednesday night with you. They were there for about how long? About a year, right? They're there for about a year as they're doing various things. And one of the things that happens at Mount Sinai is they do a numbering of the people. They want to count how many of them are there. Now keep in mind, though there are sins and transgressions that happen at Sinai that cause some difficulties for them, and God's anger is kindled against them, and Moses has to appeal to Him, that is not the moment in which God decided, I'm getting rid of a generation. When did that happen? Right, when the spies come back and give the evil report and they decide that they're going to overrule God and make a decision not to go take the land as God had promised them, that's when God says, all right, I'm done. I'm going to, well, He was really done. Moses appeals to Him again, and He convinces him, no, don't get rid of all of them. And so God decides that He's going to remove a generation from them, and they're going to have to wander for 40 years in order for that to occur. So where we're at here in Numbers chapter 26, which is the very, very end of lesson 12, I'm only going to be here for about a minute and a half, so don't worry about pulling that out. Numbers, lesson 12, last thought he shared out of Numbers 26 is what are we doing now? So we've had the first count at Sinai. We go to the wilderness of Paran, send the spies, they come back, evil report. God says, I'm done. Get rid of a generation, wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Before we go conquest the Promised Land, what are we going to have to do? Or what God wants them to do? Count them again. And the two significant thoughts that I want you to recognize is, number one, when they get done doing that counting, are they larger or smaller than they were when they started? They're a bit smaller, which is to kind of illustrate to the people that God fulfilled what He intended to fulfill. I'm going to remove a generation. And in chapter 26 and verse 64, which is the very last question of that lesson, who was left out of that numbering? Who's not there? I heard a couple of different answers. That's right. Anybody that was there, go back and look at verse 64 of Numbers chapter 26. I'll make you dizzy. Sorry for flipping through that too fast. But he said, but among these there was not a man of them whom Moses and Aaron the priests numbered. Of the men, of those that got numbered the first time back at Sinai, they're gone. None of them were numbered at the children of Israel in the wilderness of Sinai. For the Lord had said to them, they shall surely die in the wilderness. And there was not left a man of them save for which two guys? Joshua and Caleb, or Caleb and Joshua, solely because they were the only two of the spies that brought back a good report when they came back. The other 10 said, we can't. Joshua and Caleb said, let's do it, and let's go what? Let's go right now and take it. God's provided it for us. Let's go do what He's told us to do. So they're the only two that were numbered at Sinai of that generation of men who get numbered again here at after the wandering and the process of about to go and enter in to the promised land. So that's where we are. Historically, that's where we are in our study. So lesson 13. That was more than a minute and a half, but not much more than a minute and a half on lesson 12. So if you've got lesson 13, if you want it, I've got a couple of copies up here in front of me too. If you need it, if you didn't grab it, in the back there, you're welcome to look at it there. And they're still back there. And that's, by the way, what's back there is the next three lessons, 13, 14, and 15. So I'm going to show it to you on the screen as well as we move forward. So what's the next thing you got to do? Well, let me back you up one half step. So what had Moses done against God? We talked about it a couple of classes ago. Right, so he had that scene, remember, where God had said, speak to the rock and I'll bring forth water. And we talked about the kind of the twofold issue. Number one, Moses struck the rock, which is what he had done the first time when it was appropriate. But this time he strikes the rock. But what seems to be the heavier consequence? Yeah, he starts to take credit for that. He's been worn down by the people. He's been beat down by their complaints and murmuring. He's tired of it. And so he almost lashes out at them as if he's going to accomplish this, as though he gets credit for it. God's not pleased with that. Moses pays a pretty heavy price. What is it? Hey, you're not going into the promised land. So he pays a pretty hefty price. When you think about that, the numbering of the people, the only two that get to go into the promised land that get numbered, and Moses isn't one of them. He's not one of them because of the consequences of his choice. So if Moses isn't going to take them in, they're going to need what? They're going to need a new leader. They're going to need somebody else to lead them in there because they have demonstrated in many ways that they're not capable of doing that without guidance and leadership and instruction. And so who's that going to be? All right, so that's going to be primarily Joshua. Caleb's going to get some benefit because of his faithfulness in relationship to land and some promises as it relates to that. But Joshua is the one who's going to be the successor to Moses, who gets the responsibility of leading the people into the promised land. Now, keep in mind, Moses is obviously going to be what about all this? Yeah, you're going to be disappointed. You know, all this work, effort, all this energy, and because I had a horrible moment of weakness, I've not only lost all those benefits, but I've given up my opportunity to go in to the promised land. But notice what is said in Numbers chapter 27, verse 12. Numbers 27 and the verse 12. So the Lord says to Moses, get thee up into this mount, Abiram, and see the land which I have given unto the children of Israel. And when thou hast seen it, thou also shalt be gathered unto thy people, as Aaron thy brother was gathered. For you rebelled against my commandment in the desert of Zin, in the strife of the congregation, to sanctify me at the water before their eyes, that is the water Meribah and Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin. And Moses spoke unto the Lord, saying, let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, set a man over the congregation, which may go out before them, which may go in before them, and which may lead them out, which may bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord be not as sheep which have no shepherd. So God says, basically, go up on the mountain. I'm going to let you see it, but then you're going to be gathered with your people, which means he's going to die, right? Okay. So Moses, your life is ending. I'll let you see. And then Moses is concerned. He's concerned that the people will be like sheep without any shepherd. They'll not have any guidance or leadership or instruction or help along the way. And so Moses appeals to God. What's the answer to this? How can we resolve this problem of no one to lead the nation? So who's God telling to take? Verse 18. Joshua. And why is he a significant, or why would he be the kind of the right choice in order to fulfill that? Okay, so number one, he's one of the good spies, if you will, one of the ones who gave the right kind of report when they came back. Okay, so he's been there. right? He's been there. Joshua is there present during some very significant moments in relationship to the people and the things that Moses was accomplishing. I want you to run to Deuteronomy chapter 31 for a minute. Deuteronomy chapter 31, and right at the beginning of the chapter. So, parallel, right? We talked about parallel context. So when Moses went and spoke these words unto Israel, and he said unto them, I'm 120 years old. I can no more go out and come in. Also the Lord hath said unto me, Thou shalt not go over this Jordan. The Lord thy God, He will go over before thee, and He will destroy these nations from before thee. And thou shalt possess them. And Joshua, he shall go over before thee, as the Lord hath said. Notice verse 7. And Moses called unto Joshua and said unto him in the sight of all Israel, Be strong and of a good courage. For thou must go with this people unto the land which the Lord hath sworn unto their fathers to give them, and thou shalt cause them to inherit it. And the Lord He it is that doth go before thee. He will be with thee. He will not fail thee, neither forsake thee. Fear not, neither be dismayed. Pretty serious obligation that's being given here to Joshua. Moses has led them. Joshua's been by his side throughout all these difficulties and challenges that he's experienced. But Joshua's now told by Moses, listen, you're the one. We've been waiting to take the people into the promised land and the great responsibilities that go along with that. And you're the one that's going to have to take them there. You're the one that's going to have to guide them. But what's the key to that? Joshua's success has a key. What is that key? God. God's the key. The Lord hath made this decision. The Lord's made the promises. The Lord gives the guidance. The Lord's going to be with you as you fulfill these purposes. And so God chooses Joshua. Moses chooses Joshua. Joshua has been by Moses' side. He's there at Sinai with him. He's there at the tabernacle of meeting with him. Moses and Joshua are seen together over and over and over again. And it's fitting that Joshua become this leader amongst the people and fulfill the purposes that God intended to fulfill 40 years before. And you think about that. What's about to happen through the leadership of Joshua is something that should have happened 40 years before, and it should have happened for a whole different generation of people. Now, there's a couple of things I want you to think about from a practical side when it relates to that. Number one, never give up hope on the future just because there's a bad generation. Right? Just because a generation may come that refuses to acknowledge God in the way that they should, don't assume that means that it'll never have another generation that will. Because right here's a perfect example. It was not the younger generation, it was the older generation that caused the problem. Now, I'm not making accusations. I'm just trying to illustrate to us that we can't make assumptions based on whether we think things are bad in a certain generation or not. Things can be bad in a certain generation, and it may look bleak. It may look like, well, we're never going to be able to dig out of this, or we'll never see a time in which that people are more faithful ever again. But that's, through historical documentation, that's not necessarily true. The older generation created a difficulty, and they lost their opportunity because of that. And it was a younger generation that stepped forward and actually owned that responsibility and heads into the promised land here. Now, they weren't without their own faults. They're going to create problems in the future. I get all that. But it was the older generation that suffered consequence in this particular moment in time. Go ahead, Bob. I saw you. And you talking about Numbers 27 and 18? Yeah, and my Yeah, and I think obviously because of his relationship to Moses, because of the circumstance he's been in, he's already evidenced his ability to lead. And so I think God's basically, in some ways, God is assuring Moses this is the right guy. Yeah, 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 yeah. And I believe simply this is God trying to encourage Moses to realize we've already evidenced Joshua's ability to lead. And the laying on of hands here, I don't think is in the imparting of anything in particular, except as a testimony to the congregation of Moses' approval, if you will, that this is the guy that's replacing me. It's a handing over of that leadership and a means by which to show that. Yes, exactly. Because Moses is the direct mouthpiece of Jehovah, and they learned that back in the days with Aaron and Miriam. And so it's a twofold kind of situation of illustrating that Joshua is the guy. God said so. Moses, as the voice of God, is showing that as well, and he's demonstrated that ability. I think that it's a natural progression, right? If I'm part of that congregation, and every time Moses had a situation where he had to go off and get information or knowledge or certain things are occurring, Joshua's right there beside him every time. And so it's a natural progression for this congregation to look to Joshua and say, yeah, he's the right guy. If they'd picked some obscure individual that had never shown any type of leadership before, it might be somewhat disconcerting to them. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It is interesting, and I think there's this greater connection between Joshua and Moses, obviously, that you see throughout the narrative. But they obviously had shown themselves to be leaders among their tribes because they were chosen when they were looking out. Send me the best of the best, right? It's kind of the imagery in Numbers chapter 12. Send me the best of the best among the tribes to be a spy to go into the land. They were both chosen among their own tribes. And so I think that's an evidence that their own smaller communities had already recognized their leadership abilities. It's time now for everybody to recognize Joshua's. Yeah, yeah. And so he's commissioned, inaugurated, chosen, appointed to take the place of Moses. Yeah. 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 And really, and I think more. I thought about this when you talk about those things, but it's interesting too to remember though that the generation that would have witnessed those issues with as it relates to Joshua and Moses didn't are gone. That generation's gone. So it's an evidence of confidence to Moses that Joshua can do this. Who was the president 40 years ago of the United States? It'd take you a few minutes, wouldn't it? But if I asked you just a couple, if I asked you 2 or 3 ago, you could probably come up with those. And my point simply is, it's going to need the stamp of God, because this generation didn't necessarily witness, what it transpired there when Joshua and Caleb stand up before the congregation, because we're 40 years removed from that scene. Yeah. And so that concept, yeah, he would definitely need the wisdom that comes from God, number one, but he would definitely need to be able to demonstrate that. And he's going to show that pretty early on in his leadership. Go ahead, Randy. Yeah. 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 Yeah, don't forget that when they were coming down towards Sinai and they ran into their first offensive, it was the Amalekites come over to try to preempt whatever they thought Israel was going to be doing, and it was Joshua that led that military battle against the Amalekites in that moment. So he's already demonstrated his ability to lead, not just be a guy that can share good knowledge, but he's already demonstrated. But again, they'd have to historically kind of look back at that and remember what their dad and their grandpa or whatever had told them about it. But yet he has demonstrated that ability to lead in a conquest, which is what the work that's set out before him here is. All right, so real quick then, just to answer those questions in your worksheets. How old is Moses now? 120. We read that. How old when he fled Midian? To Midian, I should say. He was 40, right? We've talked about this several times. So 40 when he fled to Midian. How old when he goes back to leave? 80. So his life really can be chopped up into 40-year spans. Joshua is described as a man in whom is the Spirit, right? The spirit of wisdom we talked about, spirit of leadership, a spirit of the ability to lead God's people. List Joshua's credentials for leadership and how long had he been groomed. And we've kind of answered that in our last 10 minutes of discussion here. But he's been basically being groomed since when? Yeah. So well, I mean, you can even further back than that. Since Sinai, and if you even want to go one step further back, right, when they had to find somebody to take on the Amalekites. So he's been being brought to this moment for a long time. He was chosen as a leader to deal with the Amalekites. He's chosen as Moses' second-hand man, if you will, as he goes and deals with those things at Sinai. He becomes the leader as they move forward in the conquest of the land. So you've seen his ability to lead for quite a while. And certainly that moment there in the wilderness of Paran is kind of a stamp as he steps forward as one of the only 2 spies that are willing to give a good report in the face of a pretty angry mob, by the way. Yeah. 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 And that is the one thing that this generation that is going to go take the promised land did witness. Though their parents have died off, they have watched Moses continue to lead the people and have watched Joshua by his side through that process. And so though they may not have seen the things that happened 40 years prior, they have been under the influence of Moses and his guidance and watched Joshua work hand in hand with him through that period of time. All right, so you got 40 years, right? And so over that period of time, and we talked briefly about this Wednesday, they're not on a 40-year march. Um, they are establishing themselves in different areas. They're not moving continually. In fact, we find that in the writer of the worksheet calls it the Trans-Jordan, which simply means on which side of the Jordan? On the east side, right? So if I'm looking at a map, east side of Jordan. And had given enough time, obviously, what happens with 2.5 tribes? Okay, they become pretty comfortable over there. And they're fairly contented. Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh. Who's he, by the way? He's Joseph's, right? And so you don't see the tribe of Joseph. It's interesting. When you read the 12 tribes, you see Manasseh and Ephraim, and you don't see Levi or Joseph, right? Those are the actual two of the 12, Joseph and Levi, but you generally don't necessarily see them listed. You see Manasseh and Ephraim because of Joseph's influence, and rightly so, I suppose. Those tribes get a greater, get a double portion, if you will, each of that lineage that came from those two sons, get a greater portion because of the influence of Joseph on this whole picture. But Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe Manasseh, they go to Moses, and what do they say? Yeah, just give us this. Can't we just have this over here? We're not necessarily interested in what's on the other side, the west side of Jordan, in the promised land. We're contented with what we have on this side of Jordan. And so can we just stay here? So go to Numbers chapter 32. And so you've got Reuben, you've got Gad, you've got the half tribe Manasseh, and they see this land of Jazer, the land of Gilead, that behold, the place was a place for, it's a great place for cattle, and I've got a lot of what? I got a lot of cattle, right? So I've got a lot of cattle, and so I'm in a land that seems to be pretty good for cattle. So can't I just stay here? So they go talk to Moses, and whom else, by the way? And this name keeps coming up. Eleazar the priest, right? So they go to Moses and to Eleazar the priest, and to the leaders of the congregation, saying, all those names I can't pronounce, even the country which the Lord smote before the congregation of Israel is a land for cattle, and thy servants have cattle. Wherefore said they, if we have found grace in thy sight, let this land be given unto thy servants for a possession, and bring us not over Jordan. This works for us. Can you not force us to have to go across Jordan, okay, and go take a different land that might not be as suitable for us and our cattle that we have over here? But what's Moses' problem with that? Okay, yeah, okay. So Moses, from a reasonable and logical standpoint, in some ways says, well, what you're asking me, in some senses, is that I give you this over here, and you don't have to fight anybody to take it. You don't have to do any of the work that everybody else is going to have to do in order to go have a possession, a land in which to reside and live. So do you really think it's right that your brethren, all these other tribes, go to war and you sit here the whole time? And if that happens, you'll do what? Verse 7. Yeah. So this may be a deal breaker, if you will, a challenge to the people where they think to themselves, well, why should we go fight if 2.5 of the tribes get to stay over here and not go to war? And so can't we just recognize the difficulty that that's going to bring and the discouragement? And in fact, he compares it to what in verse 8? Yeah, thus did your fathers when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to see the land. We tried to get past this kind of thinking. This is all of us or not, right? Because it wasn't sufficient that 2 spies said, let's go take it. That wasn't enough. They needed unanimous so that they would all go and do what God had instructed them to do. And Moses says, this is just like I experienced back at Kadesh Barnea when I sent the spies in and they came back and only 2 of them, but everybody else gave a discouraging report. You're going to cause the same problem if you guys decide we're not going to go fight because we're satisfied with where we are. And so they've got to avoid that kind of thinking. And interestingly, and I didn't read through it there in the next 3 or 4 verses, but what does he basically remind them of? Okay. So he reminds them of the history of it. And if he has to remind them of the history, that probably means that they have what? They may have forgotten or didn't know it or didn't understand it as well as they should have. And so Moses has to remind them, listen, you weren't, either you may not have even been there or you were really young, right? Because that's a possibility, by the way. Don't misunderstand that. Because it was of those who were numbered at Sinai, and those were men over 20. And so technically speaking, you could have been 19-year-old young man and at Sinai, and that would make you a 59-year-old man here at the doorstep again on the other side of Jordan outside of Jericho, and you could be numbered in that group. So you may have witnessed as a young person the scene that he's talking about. You may have been yet to be born, but he wants them to remember the history of what happened the first time God wanted to give them the land. People discouraged, the spies discouraged the people, and they didn't possess it. And Moses says, we don't want to do that again. We don't want to wait another 40 years, in essence, in order to let another generation come along to possess the land. And so I'm not going to split us up and let some of them not go because they just want to live right where they're at. So what's the compromise? Okay, so you're not going to be able to sit it out, even if you want to live over here on this side of Jordan. You're not going to be able to sit this out. Notice verse 17. We ourselves will go ready, armed before the children of Israel, until we have brought them unto their place, and our little ones shall dwell in the fenced cities because of the inhabitants of the land. We will not return unto our houses until the children of Israel have inherited every man his inheritance. For we will not inherit with them on yonder side of Jordan or forward, because our inheritance is fallen to us on this side of Jordan eastward. And so the compromise basically is, okay, we still want to live where on this side of Jordan, but we're going to go in relationship to the battle. They're going to go where? Yeah, they're going to go out in the front. And to be honest with you, that's a pretty fair compromise, right? Okay, maybe we're not going to, and so we're going to go out in the front of the battle. Number one. Number two, we won't return until what? Until it's done. We're going to secure our families, but we're not going to come back home to our houses until the job is done. Until everybody has an inheritance, until everybody has a place to live, we won't return. So we're going to go in the front of the battle. We'll stick with the battle until it's completed. Everybody's got their land. Then we'll come back. And that seems to be, and is, a satisfactory compromise to allow Reuben, Gad, half-tribe of Manasseh to stay on the east side of Jordan as long as they cooperate in the battle to go conquest the land. Again, why are they... Let's get back to some basic principles here for a minute. Why? Why is all this significant? Why is all this important? Why is it so important to maintain this nation of people as a people? we can't ever lose sight of that basic fundamental reasoning behind why the Israelites are who they are and the purpose they serve. Their efforts and intent is to bring Jesus into existence. So God chose them as a people through Abraham and the promises made to him. We've seen a lot of history in our short study over the past couple of months as it relates to that. And even this bringing them out of Egypt back into the promised land, allowing for them to repossess, if you will, what God had extended back to Abraham to begin with, is all about preserving the nation until the appropriate time that Jesus will arrive on the scene. That's the purpose that God has for them from the beginning. So we're doing this together. God has chosen us as a nation. We're going to work together as a nation to fulfill these purposes that God has. And we're not dividing up, and we're not going to let some people off the hook and others have greater responsibilities. Everybody's going to do their part as it relates to these things. So quickly then, before that bell rings, why did Reuben, then Gad, and half tribe of Manasseh desire the land? Cattle, basically, right? Livelihood. It's better. If we live over here, it's a better place for our cattle and things. We'll have a better sustenance. Just let us be over here. True or false? At first, Moses likened their request to the 10 spies when they discouraged the people. It's true. It's exactly what he did. What he did was he said, you can't. If you do that, you're going to become a discouragement to the whole people, and that's not going to work out to their benefit. And if these tribes failed to assist their brethren, their sin would find them out. It would be something that they would be held accountable to and responsible for. All right. Lord willing, then we'll come back Wednesday night and pick up right there as we talk about the conquest itself. We talk about the dividing up of the land and how it is that God chose to do that.